Let me begin with an apology. I fumbled the video for Dr. Ashleigh Landau's lecture. I have re-recorded my introduction to her talk, but the following video is missing about the first 10 minutes of her presentation. Today's lecture is the inaugural Hans Angress Memorial Lecture, which is underwritten by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. It is also the first lecture named for someone whom I knew personally. Hans Angress was born in Berlin in 1928. His family fled Germany in 1937. When attempts to reach the Americas proved unsuccessful, they settled in Amsterdam, which was a safe haven for only 2 years. Hans' father was arrested in 1941. He perished in Auschwitz in 1943. Hans' oldest brother, Werner Tom, managed to get to the United States in 1939. He enlisted in the Army and served in the 82nd Airborne Division as an interrogator in one of the so-called Ritchie Boys, an intelligence unit. Hans' survival, and that of his older brother Fred, was in the hands of their mother. When Fred got a call in 1942, along with 2,000 other young Jewish persons to report to work in Germany, his mother refused to let him go and obtained a job for him with the Judenrat, the Jewish Council. This exempted all three of them from deportation. Hans studied at the Judes Lyceum, the Jewish school, where Anne Frank was a fellow student. In September 1943, the few remaining Jews in Amsterdam were scheduled to be deported to the east. With help from the Dutch resistance, Hans, his brother, and his mother found hiding places until the end of the war. The family that sheltered Hans and his family were honored by Yad Vashem for their heroism during the World War II. At the end of the war, Hans moved to the United States, and he eventually settled in Marin County. Hans was a regular speaker in the lecture series. On at least one occasion, he led a discussion section. Hans died on November 11, 2021, a day after the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht. We know for sure that Hans' memory is a blessing because it makes possible today's lecture. So now I have the privilege to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Ashleigh Landau is a research associate for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. She is responsible for conducting quantitative and qualitative research on a wide range of issues related to atrocity prevention, with a primary focus on the center's early warning project. Ashleigh is also an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University, where she teaches courses on mass atrocity prevention. In graduate school, Ashleigh and her colleagues at the University of Oregon developed a tool to measure and assess patterns of exclusionary thinking that are associated with mass killing. She has worked with government officials, practitioners, and NGOs on these topics. She has an ongoing partnership with the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights, which is where we first encountered Ashleigh. And we're very keen to include Ashleigh's expertise in a new course we're teaching here at Sonoma State University, Political Science 250, Atrocity and Genocide Prevention Simulation. Ashleigh has deep connections to the Bay Area. She did her undergraduate work at St. Mary's College. So we're especially sad that she could not join us today in person. And then Ashleigh holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Oregon. So I will now turn the podium over to Ashleigh. And again, I apologize. The following video is missing about the first 10 minutes of her presentation.
Which is also a legal term, and crimes against humanity are widespread and systematic criminal acts targeting civilians that grossly violate human rights. But oftentimes we use the term mass atrocities which does not have a legal definition, but is really a useful term because it operates as an umbrella term and it encompasses both genocide and crimes against humanity, as well as ethnic cleansing and war crimes. And mass atrocities, they've been defined by a number of people in slightly different ways, but all of them sort of have these definitions all sort of share some common features. So we define mass atrocities as large-scale systematic attacks on civilian populations. And mass atrocities can be perpetrated by state actors. They can also be perpetrated by non-state actors. They can also occur in the context of armed conflict, but they can also occur during peacetime. So a definition like war crimes, which does have a legal definition, only takes place during armed conflict, but that's not true of mass atrocities. We can actually look at a broader range of situations. So that tends to be the term that is most used now and definitely the term that we look at. So mentions of mass atrocities and including genocide, right, leads us to think of large-scale violence against civilians that really seem, right, to erupt out of nowhere. We're taken aback, right? We're surprised, typically when the news of mass atrocities hits us. And these events are often publicized after extreme violence and significant deaths have already occurred, which also contributes, right, to leading us to think that mass atrocities are inevitable as well. Scholarship, however, and academic evidence really has documented that mass atrocities rarely emerge without warning. They're typically the result of a culmination of identifiable and detectable macro-level risk factors, warning signs, and triggers. Mass atrocities are planned, mobilized, and communicated in advance. This is violence that's intentional, that's deliberate and strategic. It really takes commitment from the perpetrators. It takes organization. And so it's something, right, that doesn't really just happen overnight. It takes time. It happens over time. So early warning and assessment of these processes, this process of mass atrocities, gives us hopefully a window, and sometimes that window is weeks in advance, sometimes it can be months, and then it can even be years to act, to mitigate risks, to prevent violence. So really it's the difference between us reacting to a crisis and hopefully preventing one altogether. And of course, I understand, right, that all of this can sound very idealistic. You might be thinking, right, of course, if people have warning, and maybe if they had warning before Burma or even, before Rwanda or Syria, why didn't they act? And this is really a fair question. And this is, I would say, the biggest challenge in the field is that because early warning doesn't automatically lead to early action. We can sort of sound the alarm a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to actually act and respond in a significant way to prevent those risks. And there are many reasons for that. I'll hopefully maybe touch on a few of them closer to the end of the presentation. But yeah, this is really the hard part. Sometimes the warnings do just get ignored, but then other times there could be a host of reasons why policymakers, why stakeholders don't want to intervene. There's also the trouble, right, with maybe the media moves on and maybe the public tunes out. And so there isn't really movement behind pushing policymakers or pushing governments to actually act and prevent something. But Of course, without warning, without, some sort of analysis, without someone sounding the alarm, there's really no chance of action at all. This sort of action takes many different stakeholders, many different people, from scholars to civil society, and then, of course, to official government officials. But yeah, when effectively leveraged, early warning can shape where attention or resources go. For example, where humanitarian aid might be pre-positioned, or which countries maybe get more diplomatic attention or engagement, or where peacekeeping missions are placed ahead of time. And then, of course, also where sanctions could be placed ahead of violence, to see if it actually can dissuade perpetrators from committing atrocities. And then, of course, there are also accountability efforts. Where do those accountability efforts begin? Where should we start documenting crimes even before large-scale violence takes place? So basically, early warning can be a starting point for a whole range of responses. If we have the tools, if we know which tools are at our disposal, if we have the political will, and of course, the right people to actually listen and pay attention. So what goes into this early warning, really? It's in part, I would say it's really an identification of what I mentioned earlier, which is core risk factors, warning signs, and triggers or potential triggers. These are all things that can be strongly associated with the onset of a mass atrocity or even the escalation of ongoing violence. So just to give you a fun little metaphor, or a metaphor that I think is actually really useful and is often cited in this field. But these factors that I've mentioned they're distinct. So this metaphor, I think, is quite useful for understanding the difference between them. So one could liken them to the ingredients in a fire. So risk factors are the underlying conditions. So for example, risk factors like if the country has an ongoing armed conflict, or it has a history of past discrimination. Those are well-known or well-acknowledged risk factors in the field. So this would be really like the wood. So a lot of the time you might hear people talking about the wood is stacked, meaning, the wood is there, the country has the risk factors, it potentially is vulnerable or susceptible to this sort of violence. Warning signs, on the other hand, things like increased polarization or stockpiling of weapons or removing moderates from government. These are things that are the intensified conditions. So they could be similar or likened to gasoline in a fire. And then lastly, triggers. So triggers are events, things like coups or coup attempts or assassinations of high profile figures. These sorts of events can lead to a sharp escalation in violence, and similar to a match, can be the thing that really lights the fire or starts the violence. So putting into effect early warning to prevent atrocities, this isn't really just an ideal or something we're striving for. It's actually a legal imperative, one that's been codified in international law, but also in US domestic law as well. So I thought I'd highlight some of the legal framework for this work on early warning. So the first, I would say, obviously many are probably familiar with the 1948 Genocide Convention, but what's important to pay attention to here in the convention, and I've highlighted in orange, is that the convention obligates us to prioritize prevention. So not just to undertake, efforts to make sure that we hold perpetrators accountable for these crimes, but it actually goes a little further. And this is quite, and still is quite novel in international law. There are only a few sort of international acts or legal documents that actually do say something about prevention. So I think the idea here, right, was of course that we are trying to ensure that we're not merely reacting to crises, that we're actually working to avert them in the first place. So as I mentioned, this legislation actually has increased and expanded in scope over the past few decades, which really does bolster the importance of mass atrocity prevention. The US government has especially, I would say, made some really great strides in actually institutionalizing atrocity prevention within government, and primarily through these legal acts or legal efforts. So I just thought I'd highlight two of them, but there are actually a number of other documents or legal efforts that are really useful to our work. But the first one really is the 2018 Elie Wiesel Act. And there are a number of things that this act really does, but I thought I'd just highlight a few things. But firstly, it mandates that the US actually prioritize atrocity prevention as a core foreign policy goal. And by doing this, it basically sets forth a number of ways in which the US government can actually do this, can actually prioritize atrocity prevention. So it does this through providing early warning systems, internal early warning systems, by providing training for diplomats who might be deployed to high-risk countries or to countries that actually have ongoing mass atrocities in them. And then, of course, reporting annually, so reporting to Congress about what efforts are actually being done via this act. And then the other one I thought I'd mention really is a landmark act, is the 2019 Global Fragility Act, which directs the US government to address the root causes of violence and instability in fragile states, and by implementing long-term strategies that prioritize conflict prevention, stabilization, and resilience building. And I'll come back to this Global Fragility Act closer to the end as well. But basically, as you can sort of hear or see, is that early warning is an essential part of the legislation, and it enables us to actually identify signs of impending violence before it spirals out of control. So by closely monitoring indicators like hate speech, like human rights abuses or political instability or patterns of discrimination, the US government, as well as other stakeholders like us, can detect early warning signals or can detect signals of tension, and of course, hopefully mobilize resources to actually diffuse crises. And by fulfilling these obligations that are set forth in legal acts, we can also actually minimize the really staggering costs of humanitarian aid, reconstruction, and peacekeeping that follow conflicts. So acting proactively through prevention tools similar to some of the ones I've mentioned, like diplomatic efforts or assistance or targeted sanctions, this actually not only saves lives, but it also is far more cost-effective than responding after violence has erupted. And there have been many studies and reports that do support this. So an example of this is some really phenomenal work that was done by the World Bank. And they estimate that every dollar invested in prevention saves $16 in response and recovery costs. So I thought I'd just put that maybe into context and give us an example of what that means. So in the transitional period that followed the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the US Agency of International Development invested approximately 61 million between 1994 and 1999. Had we, say, instead invested in prevention efforts, it would have cost less than $4 million. So it would have saved us about approximately $57 million. So if you didn't need a reason enough for investing in early warning to save lives, it can also, as you can see, it can save a lot of, it can be very cost effective as well. So generally speaking, the purpose of early warning systems is to analyze or anticipate the potential outbreak or the escalation of deadly conflict. So early warning is a term that's actually used to describe a variety of activities, including conflict analysis or conflict mapping or monitoring, risk assessments. Sometimes it can also include, advocacy work of trying to actually get the message out, trying to sound the alarm. So it covers, I would say, a broad range of activities. And some of the systems that are out there, of course, might only deal with maybe one of these activities, whereas there are other systems that will have multiple activities sort of built into their process. And they can take many different forms. So some early warning systems might take the form of an index. Like, of course, if you think of like the peace index, that's maybe a good example, or maybe Freedom House has a number of different indices that they use. It could also maybe take the form of a watch list, and that you'll see that our model in a few slides kind of does a few of these takes a few of these different forms. It could give you probabilities of risk. So really it's quite broad. There are quite a range of forms that early warning and early warning systems can take. But they often, they'll utilize either quantitative tools and qualitative tools. Sometimes they utilize both. Sometimes maybe they'll just focus on the one. And really these are to assess risks and detect warning signs. So on the one hand, just talking about quantitative tools first, these tools have really high predictive capacity, and they perform usually much better than humans do at forecasting certain types of events. They have really an immediate, I would say, policy value in terms of priority setting or watch listing. So, imagine that you're a policymaker and you're reading the news, or you're getting reports from desk officers or from embassy staff on multiple countries. Where should you focus your attention if you are most concerned about maybe new onsets of large-scale violence, or if maybe you're tracking escalation? These sorts of quantitative tools can really help you sort of sort countries or sort regions into levels or categories of risk, or to help you with maybe horizon scanning across the world to really figure out where a new onset could take place. Also, a lot of the time, the visuals that quantitative tools provide can be easily understood, rankings or maps and so on. So can be quite useful for speaking with a policy audience. And then on the other hand, of course, qualitative tools. So these tools actually what provide the rich contextual information and analysis that can be usually, simple enough for desk officers to actually absorb when maybe they're not focused on mass atrocities per se. Maybe they're focused more broadly on political instability, but these sort of qualitative assessments or tools can actually be useful to them as well for their work. And they usually do have really strong built-in applications for planning and evaluation. They tend to incorporate stakeholders. For example, right, they might do so by actually providing recommendations for programs or for policy action. So they can be useful in that sense, or they might give one an idea of what one should be monitoring and tracking, especially if you have programs on the ground and you're wondering, right, are those programs are they effective? Are they working to prevent risks? So I thought, and we'll see if this works, but I wanted to see if we could just try a quick exercise. So if you could pull out your phones, and hopefully this code can be scanned easily. You shouldn't have to log in, but basically I want you to, based on what you've seen in the news or maybe simply what you might know, write where countries or maybe regions you think the next mass atrocity risk might be developing. So I'll give you a few moments to do that, and then we'll also maybe pull up some of your results. So it will be public, just so you know. This is great. Really, really interesting. All right. I think I'll stop there. And actually, we will feel free to continue putting in your what you think. This actually is quite interesting and could be useful for some of the work, the rest of the work that our center does, just to see what's on everyone's mind as well. But I think I'll stop there. And what we'll do is we'll come back to that in a couple of slides. So let me just pull up my slides again. So I will come back to the results, but yeah, really, really interesting. So really this leads me now to actually talk a bit about the work that I do with the Early Warning Project. So the Early Warning Project was launched in 2015 in partnership with Dartmouth College, and it uses both quantitative and qualitative methods to hopefully assess and spotlight the risks of mass atrocities in countries around the world. And really, we developed the Early Warning Project to be a resource for early warning and to be used as an aid to help policymakers focus time and attention on countries with the highest risk. So let me actually first dig into some of the quantitative components of the project first. So the project has what we call our statistical risk assessment. And this risk assessment allows us to quantitatively forecast the likelihood of a new onset of intrastate mass killing in over 160 countries. And the risk assessment was produced based on this understanding that in general, experts don't do well to anticipate these sorts of events. Mass killings are statistically rare events. They definitely might not feel like it because the consequences are so devastating and widespread when they do occur. But statistically, they're still relatively rare. And these sorts of events experts struggle with in terms of forecasting. So studies have actually shown that experts studying a particular topic produce poorer forecasts than dart-throwing monkeys. So yeah, pretty damning evidence, I would say. And academic evidence really suggests that statistical modeling is the more accurate way to go about identifying sort of potential future risk. But the most effective solutions actually will leverage both a combination of human expertise as well as the statistical modeling or the machine learning. So we conduct our risk assessment to help governments, international organizations, other non-governmental organizations determine where they should devote resources for additional analysis, policy attention, and of course, hopefully preventative action. So our forecasts tend to lead to public-facing reports that highlight high-risk countries and also provide tools for policymakers and others to really figure out how to interpret the assigned risk scores or rankings that I'll show you in a couple of slides. So our risk assessment specifically focuses on predicting intrastate mass killing, which we define as over 1,000 intentional civilian fatalities over a 12-month period perpetrated by a group against another group within the same country. And our full definition is on our website, so feel free to check that out. There's a bit more to it than the overview that I've provided, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what our model is trying to forecast. So like any model or any analysis really, it of course has its limitations. There are certain things that the model is not going to be able to tell you, or certain things that it's constrained by. This is very normal. You know, we don't yet have a perfect model that has, you know, 100% accuracy rate, hopefully sometime in the future. But I would say what the model is really great at, it's really great at helping you sort countries into these categories of risk to help you help show you maybe where trends could be increasing, or maybe to show you where there's been a significant jump in risk. That can be quite useful. And then, of course, for highlighting unexpected findings. You know, a human, of course, isn't going to know what's unexpected because it's unexpected to them and could be a surprise. But maybe when the model highlights it, we can identify it and think and, you know, ask, oh, why is it highlighting that country as high risk or low risk? And that's actually a really great opportunity to dig further into that to actually see what's going on. But really, this model and all other sort of statistical forecasting models are meant to be a starting point and is supposed to be used in conjunction with other tools and additional analysis. So we compile, I won't get into the methodology in too much depth, but more than happy to answer questions about it. But we compile data from publicly available sources and feed these variables. And these are variables like infant mortality rate, or has the country had a history of mass killing, or has it had any coups or coup attempts recently, or, you know, freedom of religion, and so on, and all of which can be found on our website as well. So we feed all of this data into a machine learning algorithm, and that algorithm identifies patterns and determines the most important predictors and their, you know, relative weights. And each year we update the data, we update the model by feeding in the latest data and generate a new ranked list of countries based on their estimated risk of experiencing a new onset of mass killing. So I thought it would be just interesting to show you the top 30 countries. These are the this is essentially what we would sort of call our high risk category in the model. And generally, when we're speaking to policymakers, we tend to point them to focus on countries that are falling within this category. But of course, there are definitely countries that maybe are not within the top 30, but they still are interested in. So absolutely looking at other countries that are not listed here. So the bar to the right of each country is the level of risk or percentage of risk that the country would experience a new onset in 2024 or 2025. And then countries that have the icon next to them are countries that currently are experiencing an ongoing intrastate mass killing according to our coding and our criteria. So you might unfortunately be able to see that many countries do have ongoing mass killing episodes. So important to remember that the purpose of our assessment is actually to forecast the risk of new onset, so and not the continuation or escalation of ongoing mass killing. So I think it's quite interesting to see that many of these countries with ongoing mass killing are still at high risk for experiencing new or distinct episodes of mass killing. So just thinking about the results from our word cloud, I think definitely there were a number of countries that were mentioned that are highlighted here. I think I saw China as a country, definitely saw the DRC, but a number of other countries that I think were highlighted here. And of course, countries that might not be highlighted in this risk in this top 30, and that could be because the data coming from this risk assessment goes up until the end of 2023. So we'll see when we are able to plug in 2024 data when it comes out. Usually the data from 2024 is published now or in a couple of months, so we're not able to plug it in yet, but we'll see how that changes certain countries' risk scores. And then, of course, Sudan, I know, was mentioned. There are a lot of countries, right, where you probably know from reading in the news that there are likely or there definitely are mass killing episodes occurring in those countries, but interesting to see that you all highlighted them as well as new atrocity risks, which I think is important as well to say that yes, we do in a lot of these countries that we know have large scale violence, they could be at risk for additional unfortunately episodes of mass killing. When we're talking to policymakers, when I'm talking to them, especially about the early warning project, we tend to, in particular, want to draw attention maybe to countries where there isn't an ongoing mass killing, and this is when we're specifically speaking about early warning. So maybe some countries that are in mid or medium risk within this group, so maybe countries that are in the 20s and so on, because those are the places maybe where we think there ought to be the greatest opportunities for prevention, or there is actually time to actually implement policies, to implement programs, to take sort of action, systematic action. But that's definitely not to say that the countries with ongoing episodes don't merit attention. The Simon-Skjodt Center and my colleagues, actually, this is where they dedicate most of their time, is working on ending ongoing atrocities. It's just a different type of question than what this model is designed specifically to answer. Fortunately, in the past decades, there actually has been a surge in initiatives like ours, focused on predicting or forecasting some form of conflict or instability. So many organizations and governments actually now really recognize the benefits of leveraging data for prevention. So you can see I've listed just 2 examples here of other public forecasting systems. But as I mentioned, definitely other governments and some corporations like Meta, actually have their own internal private early warning systems that they use. So qualitative early warning is equally important. So these statistical models, as I mentioned, they're only meant to be a starting point for further analysis. And qualitative analysis really is what allows us to actually do a deep dive into a specific case to really understand the history, right, the context, and the on-the-ground dynamics. And we've done, so far, we've done 6 of these reports. So we've done reports on Zimbabwe, Bangladesh, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Indonesia, and our recent one on Uganda. And these reports are focused typically on countries at that time that are not currently experiencing large-scale violence, but where experts and the models and other source of inputs really are detecting risks. So we select these countries. When we select them, we'll use our risk assessment as a starting point as one input, and then we'll gather a whole lot of other evidence to help us decide which country to select. And these reports, they do quite a lot. They're very long, in-depth reports, but they identify the drivers of violence as well as plausible scenarios and recommendations for policy options. And so I thought, just because I find it really interesting, I thought I'd just highlight the scenarios a little bit more. So for these reports, we develop scenarios for what mass atrocities could look like if they occurred. So, for example, right, who might the perpetrators be, or who might the targeted group be, and what could the trigger be? So we focus on describing these scenarios really to combat what is known in the field, is often mentioned in the field as a reoccurring failure of imagination. This is something that has been cited in quite a few past cases of mass atrocity. So based on really trailblazing research done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they explain that when people are unable to bring to mind or to imagine a reasonable scenario, they'll dismiss the idea as impossible or highly unlikely. So really describing scenarios can actually help counteract this error in reasoning. So these typically are the worst case scenarios, meaning by definition, they're not the most likely to occur. These scenarios are developed after we've done really a comprehensive assessment of the longer term risk factors, as well as the maybe near term dynamics, the more immediate dynamics, or maybe some of the warning signs. And they are meant to help increase attention on the risks and to help policymakers, help them inform their action that they take, or maybe the programming that they would implement to actually see if they can prevent the worst case outcome. So I just thought I'd briefly highlight the scenarios that we developed for our latest report on Uganda. I won't go into these in much depth, but we proposed that for all three of these, we determined that mass atrocities, if they were to occur, they'd likely be committed by Ugandan state security forces, so the police or the military and so on. And we identified multiple actors that have the potential to commit some violence, but state security forces have significantly greater capacity to commit sustained mass atrocity crimes or larger scale violence. So you can see that sort of in the second column here is the potential perpetrators that we identified. In addition, there are other elements that could be useful to understand what could trigger violence. So you can see that in the fourth column there. And really we determined that, mass demonstrations have taken place in the past and could take place in the future, typically around elections. And those could be a trigger for the Ugandan government to actually respond really harshly to crack down on protesters. And this crackdown is what, could trigger a more systematic or larger scale violence. So really, these scenarios hopefully are meant to help inform the preventative action, not just of the US government or outside actors or external actors, or maybe civil society that's outside the country, but they are also meant to help the Ugandan government as well as internal groups, help them understand how they actually might mitigate risks, how we can avoid these worst case scenarios. So I wanted to just quickly return to Burma, our example. So as we discussed, really, while the world watched, unfortunately, large-scale systematic violence erupt in 2017, And while now we're aware, right, that platforms like Facebook were flooded with hate speech much earlier than that, the Simon-Skjodt Center where I work, and as well as other organizations, were actually sounding the alarm years earlier. So, in fact, we warned about risks as early, I think, as 2013. And in 2015, our center, some of our staff from the center actually traveled to Burma and conducted extensive research and released this detailed report documenting the early warning signs that we were seeing, and that through a series of interviews, people were reporting. So you can see, just to highlight the signs that report documented, there were really a lot of early warning signs. And I thought I'd just highlight a couple of them. So in our field, in terms of the literature and what academic evidence suggests, these are some of the really common or really strongly associated warning signs with mass atrocities. So in terms of really discriminatory legislation, before mass atrocities, authorities can typically sometimes take action or take measures against civilian groups. So authorities, right, might enact laws that erode the rights of civilian groups in some way, maybe by stripping them of citizenship. They may also impose measures on groups that segregate them or restrict their movement or restrict maybe their marriages in some way. Also, another widely acknowledged warning sign is hate speech. In the period typically before atrocities, leaders might frame a conflict, or really in particular, they're a group that might show their willingness to actually target this group in some way. And we know that was definitely a warning sign that we saw, especially in the case of Burma. So while we were sharing this qualitative assessment, this qualitative warnings of risk, here's what our statistical model looked like the 3 years prior to 2017. So as you can see here, Burma, also known as Myanmar, was in the top 3 highest risk countries for the 3 years preceding the genocide in 2017. So this really is I would say, a difficult example to discuss, because of course it's an example, right, of success in terms of the actual warning, right? Both the experts and the models were accurately picking up on risks. But as we know, this was also an extreme example of how the international community and many governments failed to respond to these warnings. So, right, if warning is, of course, so critical, why doesn't it always work? So I thought I would just highlight some of the, I would say, bureaucratic hurdles or other challenges that different stakeholders, especially governments, might face that that mean that we don't end up responding to early warning. And sometimes there is a reluctance, right? And maybe that's due to political concerns or financial costs, as well as maybe interfering in the internal affairs of other states. And then additionally, as I mentioned, there are these bureaucratic issues or challenges where you have these massive organizations that are complex, that require many layers of discussion and review and have different mandates that can also really complicate the process as well. So just to highlight, I really like the way this was described. Once a colleague of mine likes to refer to the US government as a massive ship, in particular that it's incredibly difficult to turn or to act. So steering it requires not just clear vision, but it requires coordinated efforts across multiple layers. So even when signs, right, might be pointing to the need for change or the need for act, initiating that shift can be slow and complex and hampered by these bureaucratic layers or political negotiations. Another challenge that I think is really massive in terms of early warning is this challenge that as humans, we are reactive rather than proactive. Of course, we tend to focus on putting out the fires rather than preventing them in the first place. And the studies have shown that humans consistently tend to opt for immediate rewards over shorter term results. And immediate rewards or short-term results over rewards later down the road. Most people don't, this is what studies have said, is that most people don't think further out than 5 or 10 years. And when we're asked to think further out, we actually struggle. And our brain scans even show less activation the further out we are asked to think. So what this translates to in the AP world is there is this tendency to focus on the immediate threats and crises, and the prevention side can really easily fall to the wayside. Which is difficult for atrocities because we know that once atrocities are underway, it's really difficult to stop them. It's not impossible, but our actions and our options are limited at that point. And I think another thing is a lot of the time the people who are charged in governments and other organizations with preventing atrocities are the same people in charge with responding to current ongoing atrocities. So you can imagine which one, right, that you would prioritize if you had both. And then I would just say, that atrocity prevention really is a long-term endeavor. So things like, and we're getting a little bit of progress. So things like the Global Fragility Act I mentioned, this is a step in the right direction because it's a long-term effort. The government essentially has stated that it will focus on a certain set of countries for at least 10 years. So that might not sound big, but really was a landmark act within government and within policy. So hopefully we'll get a little bit better at doing this sort of work. And then I would say just the last challenge maybe that I'll mention is that within the field, especially when we're talking about the statistical models, there is still a lot of deep skepticism about technology, even models, like ours with machine learning models or AI. And that makes sense, right? It's much easier to trust a human, especially if that human's, right in front of you. But with artificial intelligence or AI, it can often, especially to policymakers, kind of feel like navigating a minefield, I would say, in the dark. But of course, important to remember that these tools, these machine learning tools or models, can help us analyze vast amounts of data with, precision and speed that, we as humans can only dream of. So we have to think about it, or we should think about it as a partnership between humans and some of these artificial intelligence, these tools. But yeah, so just to end, I would say is that fortunately, there is a strong normative and policy framework for international action to prevent and contain large-scale violence. But it's important to remember that this sort of progress is not always linear. So setbacks, political resistance, and shifting global priorities can often stall or reverse gains. So it just reminds us that there needs to be this sustained commitment to and building some sort of maintaining or building momentum in the field of atrocity prevention. And I would say as university students, you really do have the power to contribute significantly to prevention, through your career choices or other action that you might take through your perspectives as well. So, and by equipping yourself with the knowledge and skills in atrocity prevention or other areas of conflict prevention more broadly, hopefully you guys can be a part of the generation that prioritizes the prevention side over reaction and utilize both the quantitative and the qualitative. So I'll conclude and just say that mass atrocities, they're not inevitable. I hope that was a takeaway from the project. And early warning systems play a crucial role in this effort of prevention. So hopefully we can intervene early to save lives, but also to stabilize, regions that might otherwise threaten, global peace, security. So I think I will, with that, I'll end there. So thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Andy. Thank you again for your speech and for sharing all that with us. You ended with the point about artificial intelligence, and I was just wondering, I know that obviously can be used as a partner and as a great partnership with humanity, but what do you think about the use of AI in war and in conflict as it's been used? And that as many Google employees have like completely left the company over, it's just like sort of as the dark side of that partnership, AI.
That's a great question. Should I take a couple of questions or should I just take one at a time? Happy with whatever approach.
Can we gather a few questions here? Yeah, Julia.
Hi. I had a question regarding the current situation in El Salvador. So looking at the kind of mass incarcerations, the kind of media blackout, the kind of general informational kind of shutdown that has happened, how is something like that treated in terms of early warning signs of mass atrocity or mass killing? And is it seen as potentially, you spoke about underlying risk factors. Is it seen more as kind of a risk factor, or is it treated as a warning sign unto itself?
Yeah, Ella.
I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about your methodology. Specifically, how do you guys go about collecting information about a country or a region that maybe doesn't provide sufficient amounts of data, or maybe sort of fixes the numbers? Just how would you address a situation like that?
Ashley, you want to respond to these now?
Yeah, I think just to first say that all three of those questions were just excellent questions, really relevant, similar questions that we get, from policymakers. So you guys are on top of it. Trying to think of which question I want to answer first. I guess I'll just go in order. So Andy, to your question about the risks of artificial intelligence, completely agree. There are huge risks with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, right, is really a broad term that now encompasses so much. Typically, when we're talking about machine learning, and the experts in machine learning typically haven't wanted, that's existed for decades and decades, and they typically wouldn't classify it as artificial intelligence, but now it is being classified as artificial intelligence. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting field to be in. But yes, now artificial intelligence includes these, automatic weapons that are being used, as well as other things, maybe like systems that are actually making automatic decisions. So, maybe if the system picks up that there's some sort of movement, say maybe with military ships in a region, that system can actually suggest what action should be taken. So yeah, there's a lot there, I would say, to be concerned with. And this is something that our center always does, is we do a lot of work, especially our research team, with analyzing and assessing the risks, as well as, the opportunities of certain topics. So we've done this right for social media. There are, of course, as we know, and I think are well documented, there are risks to social media and how it can contribute and escalate violence and hate. There are also opportunities where how you can maybe protect civilians, how you can get messages out, how you can use those platforms to help protect civilians. So same thing with artificial intelligence. We've actually recently just finished up a seminar on generative AI. So what are the risks and opportunities with generative AI? And we'll be publishing that report, I would say, in the next couple of weeks. So definitely look out for that. We haven't yet done much research on automatic weapons because that tends to not be our focus. We're trying to focus on protecting civilians, so there are not a lot of times where we would be working on or advocating for weapons opportunities for weapons, but there definitely are other things. As I mentioned, I would say when I'm thinking about this forecasting work, I'm concerned. I think that will be our next, some of our next work, where we'll do work on these systems, these early warning systems that they might call early warning systems, say maybe in the Department of Defense. But yeah, what are the risks there? Are they incorporating an atrocity prevention lens? Are they incorporating a lens to protect civilians? These are the things that are deeply concerning. So at the moment, the extent of how we use AI is through this basic machine learning model, which, it's essentially a regression, which, is a very simple way of AI. But yeah, there are a lot of things I would say. And I think, Ella, you touched on maybe some of the limitations, right, to some of the methodology. So I guess I'll take that question next. So this is a great question because there absolutely are regions or countries where data is a bit more sparse, or maybe it's data that you can't trust as much. So for example, not a lot of data comes out of places like, probably no surprise, but North Korea, but also places like Eritrea, or Afghanistan or China. Those are places where, there tends not to be a ton of data. For the variables and the sources that we use and we rely on, then once again, these are publicly available sources, which is great because there's this level of transparency, right? Everyone can look at the data and can, report whether they disagree with it, whether it's biased in some ways. So we have chosen what we think are fairly reliable sources. And a lot of the data that those sources generate isn't necessarily, some of it is coming outside of the country, which is good in some ways, right? Because then you don't necessarily have to rely on what is coming from the officials within those countries. There are also some basic variables, things like population size or infant mortality rate, that sort of thing, where those tend to be variables that aren't manipulated as much. But then there are variables, and a lot of the variables I would say that come from Varieties of Democracy, that project. Those are variables that are coded by country experts. So say freedom of religion, or a number of other variables. So they'll use a set of experts, and some of them could be in country, depending on the situation, but they could also be outside of the country to assess the situation. And then they'll aggregate over a whole bunch of experts. But at this point, for how we have done the model, we haven't really needed to do bespoke data collection, which is something we'd rather not do, because then it has the potential of including, bias, if we're maybe, say, collecting the data just for one country. But that hasn't been a huge problem to us. But I know other sources like ACLED, the one I showed you, which is a phenomenal organization that does a lot of conflict metrics, on violent events or political instability, they're relying on the news to generate their data, and they do robust, have robust and rigorous methods to make sure that, this is not misinformation or disinformation, and that they will do additional analyses like you sort of mentioning for, say, Afghanistan, where they know they're not getting, the right information. And so they'll bring together a whole bunch of experts to do an additional analysis so that they can get a bit more of an accurate assessment. But for us, where we don't rely on the news, and we rely on variables that we think are relatively reliable, these are ones we've used for quite a while. It hasn't been too much of a big issue, but it is a limitation that we highlight that, maybe for a country like North Korea, which is not ranked as high as other countries, that definitely could be the reason why. It is a country that we have an ongoing mass killing coded, and that continues to this day. But yeah, its ranking isn't as high as one might expect it to be. And then I think, to Julia's question about El Salvador, this is something that has been on my mind for years now. These, what they call mega prisons. Very, very concerning to me. Broadly, I would say, for human rights abuses, which are, early warning signs. Human rights abuses typically do precede, not surprisingly, precede mass atrocities. For us, given the mandate of the museum, we focus on identity-based violence. So violence where civilians are being targeted because of their membership in a specific group. And that group could be relatively broad, right? It could be ethnic or could be religious, but maybe it could also be that you're political opposition or so on. But for a lot of other countries where there's high levels of violence, but it's not typically group-targeted violence. Those are situations where we haven't done a lot of work on them because maybe we're not the experts. We're more the experts in this more identity-based violence. But there are, I would say, a lot of great organizations that are doing more work on understanding and analyzing exactly the type of violence that is taking place there. But for us, if we are unable to sort of assess the identity-based component, it might not be a case that we'll take on. But I believe ACLID and some other organizations have done some shorter sort of policy memos or briefs on it. But yeah, it is absolutely a situation that's been on my mind a lot because it is concerning. We do see parallels, I would say, to mass atrocities. So yeah, I'll leave there, see if there are other questions.
Ashleigh, can I ask a question? Two questions. First of all, is all your data open source, or are you privy to intelligence? And then second, you explained how your model works. I think probably a lot of people in the classroom were struck by the absence of Israel and Palestine. Although the latest data you had was 2023, and your model predicts new mass killing and atrocity. And so I guess the war was ongoing then. Is that why it's absent from your top 20?
Yeah, happy to answer those questions, really important ones. And yeah, just to, I guess, start off by saying that there is extreme civilian suffering going on in Palestine and has been for a while. So just to start off with that point and acknowledging the civilian suffering and the loss of life. Most of my time I spend looking at the raw data, the numbers of civilian fatalities, which is definitely the hardest part of my job. The fatalities are extreme. For the model, I'll take that question first. It's an easy answer, not a satisfying one. For the statistical model, the reason why we are not able to include Palestine as a country, so currently Palestine is not one of the 168 countries that's included in our early warning system. And the reason for that is because of discrepancies in data sources, which, yes, to answer your first question, all of the data sources that we use are publicly available, open source sources. So we will never use a source that is, behind a paywall or that's coming from the government or it's coming from an intelligence community, but that the public can't access. We'll never use sources like that. So all of the sources that we use, there are big discrepancies in how they code data for Palestine. So some of them, for example, will code data separately for the West Bank and for Gaza. Some of them will combine the data from that. And then a number of organizations will include the data coming from those territories within Israel. And so there is no way for us to push all of this together in a way that makes sense to push it all together or to like unpack it. So and this is true of other territories too. So Taiwan is another case where sometimes our data coming from Taiwan is included under China. So there are a few countries or cases like that, and other maybe contested territories like Western Sahara, where at this point,
Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijan. Like
exactly.
You can't disaggregate the two. Would that be?
Yeah, they're not at this point. Some of these data sources, like the World Bank, for example, haven't been able to do that. I think things will change, and there's so much data now that is available that I think within 10 years, this will be a different conversation. But at this point, we haven't figured out how to include it in the model. But then I would say there are a number of other things that are important to remember. And you highlighted one is that, yes, we're looking at new onset. So for some countries where there is an onset, the model might detect lower risk because it's essentially saying, there's already an onset of mass killing that's targeting so many civilians that it's unlikely that a new onset in which a perpetrator targets a different group of civilians will occur. But I think the other things to note is we're looking at intrastate violence too. So violence that's occurring within a state. So in a case where the perpetrator group and the targeted group reside within the country. So for example, the model never would have forecast the Ukraine-Russia war. So they're just things that it's not meant to forecast. And there are some good reasons for that. Intrastate mass killings have been absolutely the most common forms of mass killing that have occurred. In interstate mass killing like Ukraine, Russia, those are statistically even rarer, so very difficult to forecast. But once again, we're trying to think through ways where maybe we can create supplemental models to actually forecast these situations where we haven't been yet able to do it. But there are other models that I mentioned that have maybe a broader focus than ours, that are maybe focused broadly on conflict and escalation of conflict. And those ones might be, they should be used all together. We might have the atrocity prevention lens, but maybe they'll have a broader focus, and that could be super useful to policymakers.
Yeah, Andrea.
Good evening.
Speak loud.
Good evening. Do you have concerns about your center's ability to be effective given the current U.S. global retrenchment and our mode of both irritating and ignoring our global partners? Many things that helped to avert catastrophe in the past were done by the UN, USAID, and often paid for by the United States. Can you connect the present with your future?
Yeah, and Ashleigh, I just want to say, if this is something where you put yourself in jeopardy by responding to, please don't respond.
Seems that's my kind of question. I'm sorry if I put you in the hard spot.
Any other questions? Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. With regard, you mentioned that on your top 30, ranking from Chad at 12% to Thailand at 2.7%. I'm just wondering what if this is a risk per country or risk for an absolute risk for the individual. And like you pointed out earlier just now, that you're much more likely to be harmed by interstate democide than you are from interstate activities, correct? And so I was just wondering what how your rubric could work so that the data would show the actual risk to the individual in each country, and the real risk to any given individual within each country. You follow me?
Yeah, and actually, there's one more question in the chat that you can probably see, and here I'll point out that like Jim Waller, Dr. Landau is a doctor of psychology, so she's not a historian by training.
All right, just reading. So I think a great question, in the chat as well. I'll see if I've caught it properly. Yeah, so happy to take those questions. I think, Andrea, just to your point, I think it's obviously a very timely question, a very important question that I think is on everyone's mind. And I think just to say that there's a lot of uncertainty, that I know that's obviously saying the obvious, stating the obvious that everyone knows, is we don't know how our work will change. We hope that there are things like these long-standing sort of these efforts that Congress has passed, that have been signed by former presidents, that the work there will continue, and it will be something that we, continue to be able to point to, that, the US government has stated that they are mandated that to work on atrocity prevention, and hopefully that will continue. I think with different administrations, there have been different tactics that I think we've been able to use in different ways, maybe bringing people to the museum itself, using, the power of the space in some ways for certain groups. But yeah, just to say that I agree with some of the things that you've said, that certain partners, I would say, especially for the work done for upstream prevention and early warning prevention, USAID is the type of organization that was taking forward that work, as well as obviously partnering with civil society in specific countries. But so, yes, I think that to me is hard when I try to understand who's going to do the upstream or who's going to support upstream prevention. So we'll see what different actors, what different maybe governments will help fill some of these gaps, especially the financial gaps. But yeah, happy to talk offline as well, and happy to email you as well. But yeah, just definitely something that's also on our mind as well. But yeah, then Larry, to your question, so interesting, really interesting question. So the percentages, yes, therefore the national, the sort of the level of risk that country, at a national level faces for a new onset. And so sometimes there are easier ways to say it, like, Chad having a 12.3% risk. It's, hard, right, for us to understand what that means. So sometimes turning it into saying, it has a 1 in 8 chance of experiencing a new onset, that sometimes is easier for people to understand, right? Because, of course, right, if I told you that maybe the plane you were about to get on had a 1 in 8 chance of going down, you realize, okay, that's a significant percentage. I would not get on that plane. Gives us a little bit of an understanding of, oh yeah, we should be taking action, even if it's a low percentage of risk. It's still, that we know the consequences could be devastating, that investing in any sort of prevention, even if nothing ever occurs, is better than nothing. But I love your point about individual risk. At this point, we haven't done that, and it's something that I'll absolutely think about. I would point to Ashleigh once again. They have an index called Exposure of Conflict Index, and it's exactly what you say. It gives sort of the level of risk that civilians, that any individual within a country faces essentially how exposed are they to conflict on a daily basis. And it also ranks countries around the world for that as well, because it can show you, you know, how many miles out, right, is there conflict around any individual civilian. And that's another interesting indicator of instability or the level of any sort of violence in a country, where there are countries that, you know, might not be on our list, but they have some of the highest rates of civilian fatalities in the world. And those are the countries like Mexico or Brazil, even South Africa as well, where there's a lot of violence. It might not necessarily be group targeted violence, but a high level of violence. So absolutely worth looking at some of those additional indices, but I'll definitely think on that, see if there's something that we can do on that. And then yes, to the question in the chat, I think just to say, and I'll probably might not get it super accurately, but the history of the Holocaust has especially been important for our work. It's of course very useful to be able to draw on, especially when we're trying to engage the US government, when we're trying to engage other governments, as well as using that history, using the power of the sort of the lessons learned, or maybe the lessons, right, we didn't learn, can be incredibly powerful for our work. We tend not to make comparisons, but there are parallels, right, that one can draw from historical cases. But then I would just say the importance of history is huge in the field of atrocity prevention, because a lot of the time those atrocities happen because of past historical grievances or conflicts or crimes that have gone unpunished with impunity. A lot of the time, those are the drivers for actually what's driving current conflict. So absolutely needing to address these historical reasons is so important. And I think, I mean, that's the qualitative assessment, but speaking of the quantitative model, we have a variable in the model that's past history of mass killing. So has the country ever had a previous mass killing? And that is an extremely influential variable within the model. It's highly predictive of future onsets as well. So also shows you the importance of these cycles, I guess, of potential violence.